So I will present our next speaker, my colleague and friend, Dr. Shelley Shaul from the University of Haifa, which will talk about early literacy and fluency.
Just get it open. I must say that at the beginning, when I was told I'm lecturing on the last day, I said I'll have to sit through 3 days and wait for my lecture, but now I'm actually happy because I'm able to connect lots of things that I heard during these few days to my lecture, so it was worthwhile waiting. And okay, so I'm going to talk about a different aspect that we've been talking to until today. I'm sticking with fluency, but I'm taking you down to kindergarten to early literacy. Okay, so we know that preschool and kindergarten are critical stages when children's academic development starts to develop and has an influence on their abilities later on in age. And lots of research has shown that the academic and cognitive ability of children at early age are related to their academic achievement later on. And we know this regarding to early literacy skills and early numeracy skills. All these skills are very good predictors on how the child will manage at school later on in life. And that's why also early assessment and early intervention are so good and so important and are so necessary to be done in order to help these children that we can find early on in kindergarten and help them and make the entry to school to the formal study much easier for them. During the first 5 years of life, our brain changes and white matter becomes much more dominant in our brain, and by the age of 5, our brain has 90% of the volume of an adult brain. And as I connect here to Tzvi's talk, who spoke about the lazy brain and how we find a way to do things, we know that during these 5 years, the brain actually starts to circuit and find all these connections which are so important, and we want to do it in the right way, because if we find the wrong way to do it, our brain might stay in that wrong way, and it will be much harder for it to move to the correct way of doing things. So it's important to do it, but it's important also to remember that our brain is plastic and it changes even in adulthood, and even old people can learn new things. So although it's important, we can still change things. So it's important to carry on also at older ages. And we can correct patterns, but it's much harder to correct a pattern of activation than to create one from the beginning. And that's why we think that if we get the right pattern of activation early in childhood, then the learning process will be much easier later on at higher levels and ages. So we've been talking about literacy and we've been talking about fluency, and it's very easy when children can read. We can just measure the amount of words they read per minute, and we've got the fluency or the non-words. What happens in early literacy? So all the conventional literacy skills like reading and writing, they're learned formally at school, but we know that there are skills that are learned already in kindergarten. Lots of the skills are learned spontaneously from the children hearing language, from the children seeing books, and also in a more formal way from teachers in kindergarten, which we know in the last few years have come to be aware of the importance of early literacy skills. But we know that there's no doubt that actually without these basic skills, learning to read will be impossible. We know that a child who has no phonological awareness, who knows no sounds, will not be able to learn how to read later on. So lots of studies have tried to find out what variables predict successful literacy skills at a later age. And we see that alphabetic knowledge, knowing the letters, knowing the sounds, phonological awareness, rapid automized naming of letters, digits, objects, and colors, learning how to write your name and writing conventions, and phonological memory. These are the 6 variables that account for the most variability in learning how to read later on. These have got a very high correlation to early literacy skills and to reading, and we know that they're very strong, as even if you control for IQ and SES and all the different variables which we know that are important for learning to know how to read, these variables remain very important. And if we look at the next level of variables which predict reading later on, there's the concept about print, there's print knowledge, there's reading readiness, oral language abilities, and visual processing. But what I want to show you that from all these many variables that we know are connected to reading, if we look, only the rapid naming actually has some kind of fluency or timing property. All the rest is just accuracy. So we know that in these ages, not much information is known about fluency and about speed and timing. So if we know now that what early literacy is, we wanted to see what fluency is in early literacy. And as I said, and we've had this whole 2 days to know that the role of fluency in reading is well established. We all know that fluency has to be there in order to read and in order to comprehend, as Ori taught us and showed us in the previous lecture. And what we do know also, that fluency has got very little attention regarding to early literacy skills. Fluency is from when you learn how to read, and we wanted to know what happens before. And the main aspect that has been discussed with early literacy is naming. And we know there's no doubt that naming is a very strong and a very good variable which is connected to predicting reading later on in life. So the current study wanted to examine first the developmental aspects of fluency, different measures of fluency among kindergarten children and first grade children. We had a group of children from the age of 3 to 7. And we wanted to examine the relationships between fluency measures and early literacy skills and also the first stages of reading. So we had 74 children between the ages of 3 to 6 year olds. They were all attending a private nursery school, medium and to high SES, normal IQ, and no severe developmental disorder. And we divided them into 3 different age groups, age 3 to 4, 4 to 5, and 5 to 6. And we had 54 first grade children. Also, they were all at a public school from a medium to high SES, normal IQ, and no severe developmental disorders. So, how can we measure fluency in early literacy skills when children don't know how to read? So we tried to think of different variables we could use. The one we thought would be the fluency of verbal retrieval. We all know the test where we give the child, you've got 1 minute to say all the animals you can think of, or you've got 1 minute to say all the food products you know, and then at a later age, in first grade, we also used a phoneme. Please give us all the words you can think of that start with the letter bet, the sound b in Hebrew. So that's one way of checking fluency of its verbal information, but it's not reading. And we can see how fluent the child is, how many words he could say, produce in 1 minute. And we think that this is like connected more to the phonological processing. I'm going to skip to the last one and then get back to naming. The second one we thought about was a kind of a visual fluency. We wanted to see a kind of visual scanning in a certain amount of time how many objects the child can scan and find in a correct way, because we know that the orthographic channel is based on visual processing, so we wanted to check some way of visual fluency, so we timed that task also. And the last one is naming, which we think, and I'm not going to get into all the controversies now about what naming actually is. What does it measure? Does it measure phonology? Does it measure retrieval? Does it measure the connection between phonological and orthographic presentation? But we know that it does. The child sees something visual and he has to give it a verbal name. So it is some connection between visual and auditory, and we do know that it has a strong connection to reading. And it's the kind of way we can measure that kind of fluency among children. So we had these 3 different measures of fluency, and we wanted to see what happens with them in the children in kindergarten. We used lots and lots of early literacy skill tests. We used letter identification and letter naming, which wasn't timed. Just we showed them the letter and they had to say the name of the letter. We used print knowledge, which is a word and what isn't a word. The children saw 2 stimuli. One was a word, one was numbers. One was a word, one was just letters, the same letter 5 times. And the child had to say which one looks like a real word to know the print conventions. We had word identification. We showed them 4 words and we said a certain word. They wanted to know if they could identify the word. And we had phonological awareness. We had the syllable deletion, phoneme deletion, first sound, last sound, and we had finding 2 pictures that start with the same sound. And we had additional writing tasks which I'm not going to go into right now because they completely sit on something else. So we didn't forget the writing, it was there. And in first grade, we used word and non-word reading per minute for just at the end of first grade. What's important to say is that we did a factor analysis afterwards with all these data, and we actually got 2 main factors, one which is more phonological, which had all the phonological awareness, and one which was more orthographic early literacy, all what's got to do with print conventions and visual processing. So we had 2 main factors. Let's look first of all at the developmental aspect of fluency. We looked at the age 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, and 6 to 7. We had the verbal fluency of animals and food products, and you can see that it grows very rapidly from age 3 to age 6, and we can see it grows, there's a nice developmental curve which carries on to first grade. But what's interesting is when we ask the first grade children to give us naming according to a letter, according to a sound, there's a very big drop. It seems that it's much harder for them to find words according to sounds and not the semantic category, which means that it's mainly, maybe some different system working there for retrieval, not sitting on the same system. And when we look at naming, we see a very similar pattern, which is very interesting. We see 3, 4-year-olds, it takes a long time to name objects and colors. The time reduces with age, and it stays more or less stable. Between 5 and 6 and 6 and 7, we can see that the object naming is similar, there's no difference. But when we give the first grade children a naming test of letters, again, we see the raise in the performance, which is not automatic yet, and it still takes them time. It's interesting, it looks like, as you see here, the naming time of, the naming time of the letters is similar to the object naming as 3 to 4-year-olds, because it's something very new that they're not used to doing. So it's also interesting to see the alphanumeric and the numeric naming, the difference between the 2 types of tests. When we look at the visual scanning, we just saw how many correct items the children did within 3 minutes. We can see the developmental curve here also, and the improvement in visual scanning, or if we, I don't know if it's correct to call it visual fluency. I still have to think about it, if it's the correct measure of visual fluency, but we can see that the children are doing better, and the visual scanning, which is very important for reading, improves with years. Okay. When we look at the early literacy skills, we can see, first of all, the 3 to 4-year-olds did very badly. It was very hard for them. We can see the early literacy skills are not established at this age. Between the age of 4 and 5 and 5 and 6, we see a big jump and the ability to perform all these tasks, and we can see the big difference. And what we can see is that the phonological tasks were very hard. The orthographic tasks they were able to do. That was a bit easier for the younger children to do, but we can see the developmental trend very nicely in all the different tasks. We wanted to check and see the correlation between the early literacy, the phonological index, and the orthographic index compared to the different fluency variables. We had the verbal retrieval, the naming, the visual scanning, and the visual scanning time. Some children performed the task in less time, so we looked at the time also. As we see in the 3 to 4-year-olds, only early literacy and the orthographic index was connected to verbal retrieval and to verbal scanning, but it is important to note that there is a correlation between the orthographic and the phonological 2 indexes. At the age 4 and 5, visual scanning is the only one who's got some connection to the orthographic, so we see that there is a strong connection from already 3 years old, from visual scanning, from the visual processing, to the orthographic abilities in the early childhood. And the interesting story comes here at age 5 and 6, when early literacy skills are really much more developed. Suddenly, the naming comes in as a very, very important predictor, and with a very high connection, we see the children which name much faster. They do better on the phonological and orthographic processing at early age, which is not very surprising, but it is interesting to see that only at this age the naming becomes very predictive. When we get to age 6, 7, and we looked at word and non-word reading, then we can see that all these different types of fluency are connected, highly connected to the ability to read. When I'm talking about reading, it's a score which it's got accuracy and speed. It's the number of correct words per minute, and we can see that it's got to do with visual scanning, with naming, and with verbal retrieval. So the fluency at early ages, which is a bit what Ori spoke about, that we can see is connected to a lot of abilities which need to be fluent in order to read correctly. I just want to show you a little piece of data from a larger scale study. It's a large longitudinal study that was done with Dr. Einat Nevo and Professor Tzvia Bresnitz, and I just took one small part of the kindergarten with Einat, which we looked at. And what we did was actually we took 96 kindergarten children and we divided them according to the speed of processing, basic speed of processing, not verbal. It was something which was also kind of a visual scanning task. But what we see is that children with a slow speed of processing were low on all the early literacy skills, on all the language skills, on the phonological awareness and the rapid naming. And children which had a fast speed of processing in kindergarten, we can see that they did better on all these measures. So we do see a connection in basic speed of processing. And when we looked at these abilities in first grade, we looked according to the same division of groups: slow speed of processing, average speed of processing, and fast speed of processing in kindergarten. And we look at the decoding, the reading comprehension, and reading fluency. We see it's a pattern that remains. The slow speed of processing, they had the most errors in reading. Their reading comprehension was bad, and they were the slowest in their reading fluency. So we do see this connection from kindergarten, from speed of processing, basic speed of processing, to reading skills in first grade. So if we want to conclude, we can see that fluency starts to develop in kindergarten and continues to develop, and we can see that linguistic speed of processing of fluency continues even, I think, to higher grades to develop, and we must think about it. And fluency is an important index for early literacy. We see naming really has a very strong connection. We see visual scanning also has a strong connection. And maybe also the basic speed of processing, which we don't need linguistic abilities for, is a good index for us to find these children in kindergarten and work and help them improve their speed of processing, their naming, their retrieval, and all the skills which are needed later on. But we can say that we followed all the studies and we found the same conclusions, that naming is a very strong foundation. It may really represent the first stages of reading and maybe some good index in order to find children with disabilities. And thank you for your attention. And just to remind you that children in kindergarten should also play. It's more important than early literacy skills. Through play and through fun, we need to let them gain all these abilities. Thank you.
I was in a mentor, by the way, but do you have any measures of motoric skills?
We do, but not timed. We need to, it would be very interesting. We do see, what I didn't say is we've also got very interesting information regarding executive functions, which we can see that have got very strong correlation also to early literacy skills. And I'm sure that motoric ability and motoric fluency, which we heard about today, is also an important skill for learning these abilities.
I think that we have a very nice afternoon discussion regarding the definition of fluency when it comes to your suggestion to look into comprehension. So we'll talk about it later. It's very interesting.
Okay, so time for tea. Yeah.
One question.
Sure.
Whether you task for the little children to swim because if we have the developmental process increases the number of animals or food items they call it, might be it's Mexican.
It could be
the
also
development of the Mexican and the fluency to activate those items that are represented as Mexican. Perhaps I don't know what was the number of items called by
Time, right?
but
it was timed, yeah.
but perhaps you can my suggestion would be that in remembering good work on long-term memory that you might be able to fit so my English is not enough to have the mathematical expression to fit the curve because they will start with a very quick naming and then later perhaps you can have a parameter estimating what is
the amount that they should.
The amount, if you would continue it, and another parameter that indicates the speed of activating it, and that would be the parameter from my point of view that would be a better estimate of fluency. But I don't know whether it's possible to make it.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. How do you measure fluency in early childhood? I'd be happy to hear.
Not only in early childhood.
Yeah, in general, yeah, because naming is known as fluency, but it involves so many different processes within it, also of articulation and of retrieval and of phonology and automaticity. So to find how we can measure fluency in kindergarten, I think is a very important question that I'm not sure there are correct answers regarding, but what I can say is that all the children had vocabulary. We examined the vocabulary and it was in the norm. So I mean, there were no children with vocabulary problems, but no doubt the lexicon grows with age and there's more words, so it may be easier also to. But what's important is that the speed that they manage to get these words from the lexicon might be some measure of fluency.
And this is the question, is fluency related to recall or to memory? And if this is what's underlying.
Thank you very much.